I'm here today with Dr. Nick Lewis, Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Auckland. I have the pleasure to invite him to this interview because of his expertise in geography of education, particularly the higher education, internationalization of higher education. And he has extensive experience in the Asia-Pacific region. And I have a few questions to ask Dr. Nick Lewis. What do you think the trends in higher education had changed over the past 2 decades in the world?
Well, I suspect the major pressures being brought to bear on higher education are those associated with globalizing pressures, those associated with new demands from governments, from states, as to what they want the universities to do for them in their national development projects or in building knowledge economies. The increasing mobility of students and research agendas and research monies across the world, and all of these things are, I guess, brought to bear on the way that universities operate and the experiences of academics and the experiences of students within universities. So a lot of change. It's commonly simply reduced to questions of that big bogey person in the room, neoliberalism, as universities change their responses to changing government structures, to changing funding levels. That if you really want to, you can sheet them all back to neoliberalism, but I don't think you have to do that. We can find much more kind of specific details about the changes. So.
And do you think that the changes are similar in the developing world and the developed world?
It's an interesting question. It's very difficult for us in the developed world, in the global north and its outposts in places like New Zealand and Australia to really understand what's going on in other parts of the world. And I don't think we have a very strong sense of those changes. I don't think we have a very strong sense of where they were before the changes started. So it's very difficult to measure change if you don't know where things came from in the first instance. So yeah, the literature's not great. My own experience is, I noticed you said that I have extensive experience. I suspect you're overstating that somewhat. I spent some time working with a group of academics from around the East Asian region in Singapore. And for me, that was a real learning experience as I came to understand how universities are structured in that part of the world. Before I started that project, I had no sense of what a national university was in China or Singapore or Japan. And so are the experiences different? Yes, they must be, because they all start from different places. The flows of funding are different. The legislative structures under which universities operate are different. The expectations of universities and what work they might do for the nation are different. So yes, fundamental differences, yet at the same time a range of policy mobilities, if you like, in terms of the different ways that universities should be managed and run. Those sorts of ideas are spreading very rapidly from places in the developed world into African and East Asian, South Asian universities. Very often not as a sort of top-down trickle into those places, but very often into as universities reach up to grab things, to reposition themselves in local politics, reposition themselves in relation to global rankings of universities, and so you get a lot of movement, but there's a fundamental difference in terms of the work that universities are supposed to perform or expected to perform, and the way in which they perform it, as well as how they're organised.
Yes, and most of the academic literature that we came across in graduate school of education, most graduate school of education in Europe and perhaps in Asia as well, most of the scholars talk about the negative output of these changes. But I would think that you might have experienced some of the positive output of these changes. Can you give an example in the Asia Pacific of anything that positive?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's my belief that yes, all these changes are happening, and by and large, they are regressive, and I said yesterday, regressive and regrettable. But if you're subjected to those changes, to wallow around in anxiety or self-pity, if you like, in the universities, which are on the basis of it, which are in reality very privileged places, very privileged places to work, very privileged places to study, to live and experience for some time. So if you start from a position that they are privileged, start from a position that the universities are not simply being wiped out by changes, and they still have a significant amount of autonomy and provide a lot of academic freedom still. No one tells me, for example, what to do. I mean, there are lots of pressures on me, and I'm highly privileged at a leading university in the Asia Pacific, and it's not the same for people in other universities. You put all that aside, I think you can begin to see examples. And in the New Zealand case, for example, I talked about Ngā Pai o Te Maramatanga, which is a centre of research excellence based at the University of Auckland, but in New Zealand, where they're doing really interesting things. Funding new projects, making new possibilities for young researchers, connecting with a range of community actors, developing very interesting Māori projects around things to do with the economy, things to do with community. Now, it would be wrong to suggest that this was created by neoliberalism or some of the things that we blame for the bad changes, but it has occurred at the same time, and it is connected, and it is a kind of positive outcome. I also cited another example that I've been involved with, which is the Building Research Capability in the Social Sciences Network, which in a sense is a consequence of the changes as government sought to think about how it could deal with some of the barriers to fostering capability within the disciplines that have been put in place by the changes. So how to deal with that? They funded cross-university, cross-institutional, cross-generational, cross-disciplinary program of network building, where the networks that got built were Māori research networks, Pacifica research networks, early career, new settler kind of networks that begin to fill in some of the gaps and create some of the connections that have been ripped out of the universities because of the changes. Yeah. So you get these sorts of things happening.
So changes and challenges actually create space for emerging, for new knowledge.
They do create, as long as they're not too extreme so that they tie your hands and you can't do anything new. Yeah. And these examples are drawn from a New Zealand context, of course, which is privileged.
You mentioned earlier about your experience working with Singapore, and I would like to ask you about your latest paper published last year about the mobility and desire international student in aspirational Singapore. Can you give me a little bit of background or the finding in that paper?
Yeah, I'll talk to you a wee bit about it. I should acknowledge in the first instance that I was third author on that paper, and my colleagues Ravinda Sidhu and Francis Collins actually led the work and led the writing of the paper. The paper itself is fascinating because it emerged from that project I was telling you about, a project called GUISM, which was, I can't remember what the acronym stood for, but I'm sure university was in there and globalisation was in there. But it involved researchers from across the region, and brought them together in Singapore. Singapore has lots of money, so it's all lavishly funded. I probably shouldn't say that. The Singaporean government wouldn't, maybe not like that too much. But what a consequence of this is that we managed to actually probably create the biggest data set on changing experiences among students in particular, that's been created around the internationalisation of education. So we talked to students, we talked to university leaders, we did a questionnaire, so we have a lot of kind of quantitative material to draw upon. And I guess what the paper did was challenge the presumption that all of the decisions that are made around these processes of internationalisation by students, challenge the presumption that those emerge from rational choice decision-making processes, and that those processes are how we might imagine them if we're not the student, if we're the university or the researcher from the outside, or maybe even the parent who's paying for them, imagines that students are doing certain things because they read the rationality off a predefined grid. Now, what we were able to find, of course, is lots of different motivations, but no discrete motivation, no discrete independent motivations that sort of add up to something or influence it. It's all a mix, and it's about aspiration and desire, and students positioning themselves within their family, within their national economy, within the global economy and global labour markets, a range of different aspirations at work that are very difficult to reduce to one-on-one kind of, not one-on-one, that's the wrong way of saying it, that are difficult to reduce to single variables to explain things. So they're always contingent and always dependent upon the individual. Each of the individuals has a range of different effects at work on them, different socialization processes. And so you have students who some of the students I talked to in Osaka, who discovered comics. They were there because they fell in love with Japanese comics at an early stage. And others who had a desire to work in a foreign office, others who just had a desire to know more about the region. And if I make one more comment there, one of the really interesting things that it taught me, this project, maybe less the paper itself, but the project, is that in this part of the world we come to understand internationalisation as an industry. New Zealand government, New Zealand universities seeking to fund their activities by selling education to international students. And we come to see it being all about English language acquisition. But of course, large numbers of students move not in order to study English. In fact, increasingly in order to study Mandarin. So they're moving from the US and moving around the East Asian region for that purpose. Or they may be moving to position themselves for jobs in Japanese in Japanese global corporations and so on. So there's a great deal of complexity. And in the Singaporean case, they haven't charged their international students. So it's about developing Singapore as opposed to making money to fund domestic education off the back of international students. So lots of complexity and desire is something that Ravinda and Francis are interested in as something that's inside the body, inside the mind, inside a range of cues, social cues and so on.
I know that you have experience teaching international students here in New Zealand and also supervise international students as well. So what is your learning point by working with international students from different cultural backgrounds who travel a long way here, and how is it different from what you've seen in Singapore?
That's an interesting question. The second part of the question would be more difficult to answer because I haven't spent time in Singaporean classrooms or with so the work we did was very short-term kind of interviews, so very difficult to get a handle on those kinds of things. But I will say some things about engaging with international students in my own work. And it's always a great pleasure, but a pleasure that comes with a number of challenges. Of course, the challenges, we often think about the challenges from a student's perspective. There are also challenges from the academic's perspective. Working with a student whose cultural background is different, whose response in supervisory relationships, for example, is very different. I mean, it's wonderful, but I always feel awkward, for example, that my international students give me gifts. You know, and am I supposed to reciprocate? I've actually never asked anyone within the university, am I supposed to even accept those gifts? I mean, I do accept the gifts because it's a cultural practice and it's fun. And there's something around the way that, you know, that our British traditions, I guess, around the academy, and we're just doing it now at Old Government House, having a beer with students afterwards. Many of our students are non-drinkers from international students. So how do you replicate that moment of that really rich moment of engagement with a graduate student that occurs within a pub or a bar or something when you're after work and you're relaxing, and it's a moment of rich learning that doesn't get replicated so easily when you're working with students who don't drink. And so there are lots of little things there, and of course the language issues of writing and are always difficult. It takes a lot longer to work with an international student. Often, if they're a second language student, your commitment as an academic has to be stronger, just as the student's commitment. But I do marvel at the way that people can learn in a different language. You know, I can barely string together 15 words in French or you know, a few words in Māori, but that's about it.
Yeah, but I really enjoy your sharing of experience, and I believe that once a student, international student, decided to go abroad to study, it's also very courage. You know, it takes a lot of courage to travel. But once they study in one place, they probably become friends of the country for life. And I think that the experience working with the professor in another academic culture is probably it's really precious for experience for international students. And thank you for being with us today. Thank you.
You're most welcome. And you know, anytime. It's always a pleasure to work with students and to work with sort of such a talented group as the UNIKE students. So
thank you very much.